Welcome to Behind the Retouching with the Art of Retouching Studio. My name is John Ross, and this image is by Felipe Buccianti, who is both the photographer and the retoucher. What I'm going to be doing in this video is evaluating Felipe's retouching. At the same time, I'm going to be adding my own spin on it and how I would handle particular problems and situations, and then you can see what he did as well as what I did. This video is created specifically for Felipe, however, because of the good content that is included, there's no reason that everyone can't learn from it. So this is the original image as he had supplied it to me, and then this is with his retouching. And the work that is done properly. I'm going to show that there is cleanup in the image. Okay, he removed a lot of flyaway hairs, and he cleaned up the skin. Very nice. And then as we get into the lower areas of the image, he stopped doing work. And this is a problem that happens a lot with students where they become so focused on the focal point that they forget about the rest of the image. And this is one of those cases. And in fact, this is one of those images where we know where we should be looking, which is at the eyes. However, we don't know where to look in this particular image. Is it the eyes? Is it the hand? Is it the hair? The background? I really don't know. My eye is wandering all over the place. And in cases like that, it doesn't matter how much retouching is done or how beautiful it is. Your eye is going everywhere else but where it actually should be in order to retain the most attention from the viewer for the longest period of time. And in this case, it should be in her eyes. That's where the story is, with some accent on the hands, because that's a secondary story. Perhaps this hand right here. Why is it covering her hair? I don't know. But there's no reason that we can't emphasize what we want to emphasize while de-emphasizing the rest of this. So now, while I would normally have gone into a raw file and started at the beginning, I felt that Felipe's image was solid enough at this point after a first round that I didn't need to go in and redo all of that work again. So I'm actually going to pick up from where Felipe left off. On a technical standpoint, I would like to say this about this layer structure. I see many students doing the exact same thing. I'll give him this. The layers are clearly labeled, which is excellent, and that helps me make an educated decision in helping him. However, there are generally too many layers. There's too many breakup of layers. And again, this is on a technical side, and everyone has their own style. I guess what I would say is this. We have this background layer, which is white, and it does absolutely nothing in this case. I could turn it off, and it's not going to matter. So if that's the case, throw it away. Okay. All it does is add to the file size of the final image. We also have this layer right here, which if I turn off, it doesn't matter. Well, why is that? Well, that's because when we go up to the top, what Felipe has done is he's flattened the image in order to get him to the next stage. And every time you flatten an image, you can't actually go backward. The real problem here is if I asked Felipe to go back and fix this, he can't just go back and alter layers that are already created because he's flattened it at this point. So if I were to hide this layer at the bottom, and we come back up here to the top and I hide this, you can see that it has a sharpening effect, but there's still a layer underneath it. Is it this one? Is it this one? Is it this one? I don't know. Somewhere in here, there's going to be another flattened version of this image. Okay, so basically we have a version here, and a version here, which is building off of this version down here, and this one's irrelevant. So if you can start to see the way that I'm mentally processing this, I don't know where I am going. Now I realize I didn't build this file, but the point is I don't know where the beginning, middle, and end of this file is. If this was built in a linear fashion, you should always be able to go back to the point that an adjustment is made. And as I move forward, you'll be able to see how I start breaking apart files and working on this. If you would like to see me actually do this from the beginning on an image from the raw, there's another video around here somewhere where I help another student and I start at the very beginning and I go from there. So he's done a nice job. If we zoom in, we can see the skin is generally pretty clean. The eyes aren't blown out to white. There's still detail. Everything looks good. However, there are definitely things that could be improved upon, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on from here going forward. Now, rather than actually building onto all of these layers, this is actually too much information for me. So I can actually grab this one, throw it away. This help layer doesn't do me anything. I'm going to throw that away. And then this frequency separation doesn't help me, or this, 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 or this. So right here, these two layers, this IHP and layer 4, basically these are the two layers that are doing things inside of this image. Now I realize that Felipe wants to keep all this old stuff, and that's fine. For my purposes, I'm going to get rid of it because I don't need it. To me, this is where I'm starting at the core of the image, which is Felipe's final work. I'm going to grab these two files, and if you watch my other videos, you should know that I always work off of smart objects. So in this case, instead of working on this layer structure that's currently here, I'm going to grab these two elements. I'm going to right click and go convert to smart object. So normally I would consider this the raw file so that I can go back to Adobe's Camera Raw to edit. Since I'm not going to go back that far, I'm simply going to take these existing elements, compress them into a single smart object, and then I'm going to move forward from here. Now I'm often asked, what do I work on first? Do I work on tone or do I work on color? And then I say, well, what's the image? It totally depends on the image. And in this case, this particular image, what strikes me first and foremost is it's too green. This image has a green tone to it. And while there is the whole topic of color grading or whatever, I'm going to focus on the fact that this probably wasn't meant to have a green tone, and it simply does. So I'm going to fix it as one thing. The other thing that I'm going to be working on as a problem is that the elements in the foreground, the model, match very much to the elements in the background, which is just this gray screen. So effectively, she just blends in. There is no depth or things happening. It's very, very flat. This whole image is flat, meaning, while it's a different color, the basic tone is the same as her skin. And that is the same as her shoulder. And the shoulder is devoid of any texture in the actual fabric. So basically, if I was to take a black and white filter and put it over the top of this, when I do this, it's a lot easier to see what is the brightest part of the image. And why does that matter? Well, the brightest part of the image comes forward. The darker parts go backward. By the same thing, the warmest elements come forward and the coolest elements go backward. And basically, that's just two ways that we create depth within the image. And in this particular case, when we start dealing with tone first, this image, the brightest part is down here. It's not up here where it should be. It should be in her face. That should be your brightest point. Things that are down here are distracting. And that's why when you look at this image, your eye is pulled downward. There's nothing to force you up. So that's one of the big things that we need to address here. The second thing is the color scheme of it. And the color scheme of it is, once again, it's got a green tone because there's too much yellow in it, but as an overall problem. But also, there's no visual color punch. There's no warmth bringing this forward, separating it from the background. So another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cool off the background and warm up the foreground. And then another major thing that's bothering me. Now, this is totally me. I don't expect you to necessarily need to do something like this, and certainly not all the time. But in this case, when I first opened this image, the very first thing that struck me is this model's head is too long. Basically, it's right here. And it could either have been the way that she looked, or perhaps it was the camera doing some distortion to it, or who knows what. All I can do is base my judgment on what I see. And what I see is her face is very long, and she looks very sad and droopy. And it's that droopy part that I want to get rid of. So I'm actually going to do a little bit of liquefy in order to squeeze her down a little bit, just so that this isn't something that bothers me. Doesn't mean that you have to fix this. This is something that simply bothers me. Now that I've given you a bit of a warm-up for this, let's actually get to doing some stuff to this. Now, because future things doing color and tone are going to involve masking, the first thing I want to do is liquefy in order to fix the distortion, what I consider a distortion in her head. Now, liquefy is one way to do it. I suppose puppet warp is another way to do it. There's also a free transform that would technically work. I'm going to use liquefy simply because I choose to. That doesn't mean it's the best way, and it doesn't mean that you need to do it at all. But I'm going to go through the motions anyway. It'll make me happy. So I'm going to go filter, liquefy. Now, the liquefy window in general is too big for my recording screen, but for our purposes, it's perfectly fine. Make sure that you check on advanced mode, because by default, it doesn't give you enough options here in the toolbar. That's where the real problem is. So we click on advanced mode so that we get all of this stuff that we aren't going to use. But basically, when it comes to general liquefy, we want to use masking, which is here and here. And without the advanced, we don't have access to it. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that Photoshop by default uses brush density and brush pressure up at 100%. And the problem with that is when we do this, it does some very strange distortion very, very quickly. And we don't want that. So rather, we're going to drop this down to something a lot smaller. So I'm going to bring this down to 20 and 20 so that it doesn't do nearly as much damage to the image when I'm doing this. So if we want to create a mask, I'm going to click Freeze Mask. And it's funny how they name it, but basically this is just creating a mask. And this right here simply gives it a point that it will not touch. It will not touch this mask or anything below it. And all I'm interested in right now is up here. So then I'm going to come back to this first tool, which is the forward warp tool, give myself a nice big brush, and then I'm just going to push downward. I'm going to click and drag. And I'm going to do it a couple times. And now I'm going to try and look at behind this mask. So I can click Show Mask to turn that off. And if you can kind of see, basically I just brought her forehead down as one step because it was too tall. Now, another thing that's bothering me personally, and again, this is getting a little bit too much in some cases, but the other thing that's bothering me is her nose and her lips. And it's just, she just has such a long face in this image. So I'm just going to get a big brush again, and I'm going to push it up a little bit. However, because we have this mask on that area, so what I actually need to do is remove this mask. So I'll go to this icon right here, which is Thaw Mask, again, strangely named, and just simply come across and erase it is really all you're doing. Then I'm going to come back to this forward warp tool, and I'm going to start pushing it up. Now I can see where you may not want to do this because I'm physically doing some strange things to this model. And I get that. You may not want to. Again, I'm doing this because it caught my eye and it's simply something interesting that I can talk about. And the other thing that's really bothering me, to be honest with you, is her nose. This is one of the other things that's just too far down in her face. So now, I don't mean to make too much out of this. I'm just giving you an idea of what I would end up doing if this was my own image. So now, because we have this warp down here, I'm going to bring it back up. I'm going to open up this brush pressure and density just so I can do this quickly. So now I'm generally happy with this, so I'm just going to click OK. And now it's going to do its liquefy thing, and it's going to bring it into Photoshop and attach it to the smart object as a smart filter, which means I can go back to it whenever I want to. Now, if you look here, we have a smart object, we have the smart filter with a mask, and then we have the liquefy filter. And as you can see, I've completely just squished her head. I happen to like it, but maybe it's a little bit too much, for example, and we want to fix this. So because this is a smart filter on a smart object, all I need to do is just double click on it, and then I go right back into the liquefy using the exact same settings that I had before, as if I had never clicked OK. And because of that, I can come up into this reconstruct brush again and possibly bring her back down a little bit. But in those cases, we need to change the brush density and pressure from 100 to something more manageable at like 50. When it finishes updating this, you'll find that it isn't as squished as I originally had it. That's all. To personal taste, and even if you know the person, then it matters. And that brings up another point while I'm waiting, is that it matters when, if you know the person and it's a distinctive person and it matters as a person, you don't want to change those distinctive features about the person. So in this case, if you knew the person, for example, your wife, you don't, and she happens to have a long face, you don't want to go squishing it for no reason. However, if this is just a model in just an image, and in those cases, yeah, go for what equates to pure beauty. And to me, it was just the long face just looked sad. That's all it was. So in this case, she looks more intentive than sad. To me anyway, to each their own. So now that we have this as a liquefy, I'm for the purposes of this, I'm happy with it. And I'm going to suck this up by clicking this. And then now it hides all this within this smart object. And now I can move forward into some of these color correction things that I want to do. So when it comes to color and tone, remember what I said. Bright goes forward, dark goes back. Warm comes forward, cool goes back. So we're going to honor those principles up here in these different areas. And the way that I'm going to do this is normally I would be going right into camera raw filter, which would be inside of here. But since I have your loose files inside of here, when I double click on it, by the way, you will see that the original files that I had preserved are safely nested inside of this layer. And it opens up as a separate element, and then here are those two layers. And if I wanted to update here, it would update back here. I'm going to go filter, camera raw filter, and I'm going to pretend as if I was working on the raw file. But in this case, I'm not working on the raw file, I'm working on the filter. If we came over here and I said, the first thing that strikes me is that it's green. So what I want to do is remove some yellow from this or add magenta to this. So my start is going to be add magenta, and I'm going to pull this up. Now, I'm actually not even worried about this background right now because I'm going to do something completely different with that. I'm thinking about the skin tone here. Primarily, I'm looking up in the flesh tones here. Is this too much? Is this not enough? I don't know. But if I ignore the background and focus here, then this might be okay. I'm not sure. I'll make it like 5 and 18. Click OK, and I'll see where I am. Okay, so now this is a start. Now it's difficult for me to start judging whether the color is too yellow, too pink, too whatever, until I decide on the background. So for this background, I'm going to create a mask. Now I'll go up under Select Color Range. Now the thing is, by default, color range is set up all wrong inside of Photoshop, to be honest with you. When I click here, I have no idea what I'm selecting or doing, and I'm just going to cut right to the chase. If you double click on this icon right here, and you can change this to selected, change this to 100%, and pick a color. Red is okay, but because I work on portraits all day, which has red in the flesh tones, I make it green. I go okay, go okay. Now, I have videos on my website that actually explain all this, www.theartofretouching.com, which explains quick mask and color range. In this case, if you just make these changes and not even know why, you'll be happier for it. After you come out of that setting, this is still selected that you double clicked on before, so we're going to click it once more. It's some bug that's been here forever, and I really wish they fixed it. But let's go back up to select color range, and then change preview selection down to quick mask, which is actually hiding off, so I'll bring it up. Selection preview quick mask. Now when we click on something, we can see clear as day what we have selected. I'll select this and I'll cut this out separately. So 40, I grab the background and I'm grabbing too much. I'll go okay. Once it finishes selecting, I click on this icon down here, which is quick mask. Now I can paint with my paintbrush. I'll go with the paintbrush, and black is going to paint green, white will erase the green. So because I want to cut out, I'm going to go with white and simply do this. And if I'm going too fast and you don't understand, once again, go to my website and watch some videos. There's actually a 20-minute video where I explain this very, very slowly for anyone who doesn't really understand what I'm doing. So now that I've cut out this very quick mask for this background, I click that again. Now I have a selection, just a simple selection. Follow along with me. I'm going to create a group folder, and I'm going to apply this mask, the selection, to the group folder by clicking this icon here. Now I've created a mask to a folder with nothing inside of it. But anything I put inside of it is going to honor this mask. So with that said, I'm going to select hue saturation, and then I'm going to click colorize. I'm going to change this to a bluish color, blue, purple, something, doesn't matter. But the point is it's going to be one of those cooler colors that goes backward. I'm going to drop the saturation so it isn't so obvious that I made it blue. And I'll drop the lightness just a little bit, just a little bit to dim it down. Because we don't want to do too much, because if I actually do this, you end up seeing the halo and it looks strange, and that's not what we want to do. So dropping it down this, no one will see it, no one will know, it'll be fine. Now, because this hue saturation is inside of this group, it honors the mask I just created with quick selection and color range. Something that I'll do in an image like this, because this is a studio shot against a gray screen or a white shot or something, like what's behind me here, and there's nothing to grab onto. There's no depth, there's no texture, there's no nothing. It's just flat, which I find incredibly, incredibly boring. To each their own, do what you want, but I'm moving forward with what's going to help this image. So very quickly, I'll go into Google and I'll go texture, images for texture, and I'm going to randomly pick something. It doesn't really matter what it is specifically. And I'll pick something else, maybe this one. When the bar finishes, it's done. Right click, copy image, edit free transform, bring it back up to here, stretch it out to here, bring it back. Okay. And then drop this opacity down so it's barely shown. There we go. If you want, you can change it to luminosity, but I don't think it matters at this point. Just so that there's a little something back there and it's not flat. If you don't like that color, we can adjust it by either darkening it or changing the color a little bit more, a little bit purpley. I don't know. Just something that works. Because basically, if it's warm, it's going to match too much. If it's yellow, it's going to look pukey. If it's green, it's going to look odd. So that's why I said just a blue shade of something. Just something to break it up so it isn't just gray, boring gray. So it wasn't a flat background. So now this just gives it a little something. And even at this point, it really doesn't jump out at you simply because her flesh tone still looks a little bit flat to me. So I'm going to zoom in here and I'm going to do a couple things. I want to know what values are actually going on in her flesh tone. So I'm going to open up the info palette here and hover my cursor over, and then I'm going to look at the CMYK value over there. And it says that it's 2% cyan, 18 magenta, and 20 yellow. I'll move it around, but it's basically going to be approximately the same thing, where there's 2% less magenta than there is yellow. I often find that I like magenta a little bit higher to give that pink tone that people normally have, as opposed to yellow. But in general, this is kind of okay. This doesn't really bother me. It depends on what you're using it for. I don't have a problem with these values at all. So I'm going to bring that up. And if I do want to, I can go back to this camera raw. Why? Because it's a smart object. I can just double click on it and go back to it without needing a whole new layer. So now that I'm back inside the camera raw filter, I'm going to address two of the problems that we currently have. One is that I think this should be just a little bit warmer, tiny, tiny bit. So I'll make this like 7 and 20. Do I need to? No, but I think maybe it'll help just a little bit. It's subtle, you'll never notice. And again, it's the monitors, displays, whatever, and even what I'm teaching on is my junky classroom computer. So the monitor is not anything spectacular either. So let's just assume that I fixed the color tone so it's nice, it's rich, it's vibrant. Now let's move on to the next problem that this image suffers from, which is where am I looking? Remember when we had the black and white over the top of it, that the brightest part was right through here, not where it should be. So the way that I handle this in most of my images, if you actually look through my portfolio, you'll see me doing this now that you're aware of it. I do it like all the time. I'll come inside of Camera Raw over to this graduated filter. You could otherwise use a graduated mask attached to a curve and do effectively the same thing. So by using the graduated filter here, I'm going to click and drag. Now by default, it picks up whatever settings were last used, good, bad, or different, but I'm just simply going to click down here and drag up. Now, if you'll notice what happened in this case was it simply darkened this lower area. And I'm gonna pull that down just a little bit more, so I pulled down the highlights. Notice it's actually all I did. The saturation, I don't want to touch the saturation right now, but I just pulled down the highlights. And if you see my before and after, I'm going to uncheck overlay, so it hides that. And then I'm going to click this here. In new versions of Photoshop, this is your undo button. In slightly older versions, it's up top. I'm going to undo. And in this case, you can see that it's stopping your eye from looking down and bringing your eye up to what is now the new lighter part of the image. I didn't even touch your face. All I did was just darken the bottom part by clicking on the mask again and then darkening this exposure. When I do this, I like to make it obvious enough that your eye doesn't wander through the image, but at the same time, I don't want to make it so dark that it becomes obvious that I did this. So it's one of those soft, subtle things that I'll often do. And like I said, if you look at my portfolio, just about every image has it in it where I'm darkening the bottom to bring your eye up to the top. Okay, so I darkened the bottom, I brought it up, and I like that, and I'm going to click OK, and then I'm going to see how it looks in this image here. So far, I think it looks pretty good. When you look at the before and after, you can see huge differences I've made in what is effectively a short period of time without the teaching aspect of this. But you may find this is a little bit much. I'll agree with you, sure. You know, it doesn't have to be that beating over the head because that's actually distracting from the warmth of her face. So let's push this back a little bit. We'll go to the hue saturation and just drop the opacity on it. We'll go down to 0 and just bring it up. And a little bit goes a long way. But effectively, by changing this background, warming her skin, even shrinking her head, and then darkening up the background, you can start to see that your focus starts coming into where it needs to be. And this image, when compared to this one, just looks very green and flat, and it lacks any depth and detail that this one starts pulling out. Now, some of these choices I make are my own, to each their own. You don't have to follow them. These are simply my suggestions on what I like personally. Now, I would say that her face is a little bit smushed and I could open it up a little bit, but I'm not going to go back to all that. So now that we've done some of that, you'll also notice that it fixed this area down here where I was originally said that it was flat. Well, now that we have that gradation going on, there's a little bit more tone coming up and it looks like it's curving, so it's not something I'm really focused or worried about anymore. Now, these were some of the bigger global changes that I thought the image needed. And if you want, you can click on the black and white again, throw that over the top, and see, did that work? Well, if I put the black and white on this one, I'm sure you can see that it worked. Okay. So this is very flat. I don't know where to look. And this one, it's more focused in here. And even the shoulder's a little bright, but you get the idea. It's a far cry from where this one was going. Your eye is attuned to tone, not color. So now that I did some overall changes, let's get into some of the more detailed changes, shall we? When I came up here and I looked inside of her hair, you've already actually done a lot of cleanup inside of the hair. I mean, it used to be a whole lot worse before Felipe did what he did of cleaning these up. However, I still think this is a little bit too much. Now, I get the point, the whole messy hair thing, it's the in style, I get it. But I could still argue that a lot of these very fine cobwebby types can just go away. This is just a little bit much, and here's a little bit much. You can still achieve the same look of the messed up hair without having all the distractions. And by putting this texture into the background on mine, much of those problems went away. And as I get up close, I'll just address this. I would not leave the hair like this. Obviously, this was a quick mask. I would come back over here with a brush and paint it in like this, maybe with a lower opacity or something. Yeah, no, if you thought about this like 20 minutes ago, whatever. I'm not focused on it. This is details. This is stuff you don't need me for. So, all right. So we've done that. So let's look at some other things that we can do to improve this image. So when we want to start getting into some details, let's take a look at what's going on with her lips. This is one of the first things I noticed, that her lips had this funny shape to them, and I don't know quite what's going on here. In one of your layers, you had corrected the tooth, so I was a little surprised that this was left behind. Just simply smooth it out a bit. I don't know why it's quite so bumpy. It just looks strange. The other thing that I noticed here is that these lips had a bit of a fall off here and a little bit here. And basically, I'm not saying that she needs lipstick to be overly enhanced. I just found that it lost shape because I saw the pink of the lips and then it wanders into a purple and then the flesh tone, and it lacked some definition. So I'd probably just create a little bit of a shape to it on both sides and define it just a little bit more. When I come up here, you'll notice that these eyebrows do some, you have layers that corrected the eyebrows and made them nice. However, we have this oddness here. And again, it comes to one of those cases where, is this the person or is this a random model and it's just wrong? So taking it from the point of view that this is a random model and it's wrong, because I have no idea who this person is, I'll say that this eyebrow is better. So actually cut this section out and move it over here. Very simply with a lasso tool, quickly, not even to think too much about it, I'm going to copy, paste, move tool, move this over a little bit, do a free transform, flip it, invert itself, come back, rotate a little bit, and basically just line it up and clean it up. A little opacity to do that. Great. Open that up. And then just put a mask on this right here. Go to the paintbrush with, this is white, so we go to black. From 80% to 20%. Drop this down and kind of clean this up. Something like this. You get the idea. I mean, just make sure that it's lined up properly and everything's even. But in general, this just looks better than that does. That's all I'm saying. The other thing that's really distracting me are these white halos that are going around these eyelashes. Now, in your image, you actually did try and address this at some point, but I really didn't feel that it worked very well because it's still here. Now, based on what I have in front of me, this is actually in the original image, so I don't know quite what happened. But what we need to do is we need to correct this. And now, one of the simpler ways to correct this is to just come up with a new blank layer, zoom in on it, get a brush of a nice small size, select one of these darker colors with your eyedropper, and literally just paint it in. If doing it at 100% is too much, you can drop the opacity down a bit and go over it a couple times. I'm using a mouse instead of my Wacom tablet. This is one of those examples where I would use the Wacom. And you might say that, well, you're filling in and it's black on black and it doesn't look right. Well, the problem is the white on black doesn't work either. So choose your battle, I suppose. It doesn't have to be absolute, but it certainly has to be more matching than what we currently have. That's all I'm saying. There really is no easier way to do it than this. And all we're looking to do is fill in some of this white and just very slowly come in here and clean this up and get more of what we want. In general, these eyelashes are pretty mediocre at best. So there's two different choices. We can go the fast way or we can do the long way. The faster way is to cheat effectively. So if we come up under our brushes here, I have them already loaded, but you can go download them off the internet and you can get eyelash brushes. So if I click this one right here and I come over here and I already have my color selected, create a layer for this specifically and do this. And now we've painted over and it helps. Another way that you could do this is instead of painting on a layer like this, you can go to quick mask, paint with a quick mask like that, come out of the quick mask and use a curve instead, or level, whatever meets your need, and do it this way. And then this will also create the same effect. I'd probably do it this way because now I can adjust this curve a little bit more after the fact. So that's one example. Now that we have a brush that's like this, it's going in the wrong direction. We would use the brush palette, flip it invert, rotate it a little bit. And on the same mask with white instead, with right there. That's just simply a quick example. That's one way to do it. The other way that would arguably be more professional is taking a very small brush, using your Wacom tablet, and literally start drawing in eyelashes. However, obviously this looks pretty crappy. There's a better way to do it. Open up your brush palette again, click on Shape Dynamics. So I checked it to turn it on, I clicked here to turn it on, and then go to Control and turn this into a fade. You have to play with this value a little bit, but so now we can come in here with our Wacom tablet and literally just start painting in these eyelashes. And because it's set to a fade, you don't have to think too much about it. If I was to do it this way, I would create maybe two layers, one that's dark, one that's light. And I would go over it once like this, and once again that's lighter. I would probably leave them as curves so I can adjust them afterwards. Like for example, if this is too dark, just adjust the opacity, you know? I mean, it makes more sense this way. But the core problem is being corrected. And before I talk about that, I'm going to change this back to off and then turn off Shape Dynamics so I don't do that again. And click back on Tip Shape and then close it. This way, those specialty settings are returned back to normal. So as I was saying, at its core, you know, all we're really trying to do is to fill in these eyelashes in a way that's more realistic. And up here, you know, it's darker, but it's not filled in with actual eyelashes. So if I was to do it professionally, this is the way I would do it, one eyelash at a time. It doesn't take you that long, especially if you got a Wacom tablet. That's pretty straightforward. Okay, a quick easy one is over here. Notice that her tear ducts here and here are different. This one would technically be more correct because basically we don't want to pull away from the catch light or anything. They just simply are there. So this is a very simple change. I would just go to a brush with a quick mask. I'd paint in this area here, come out of the quick mask. Any way you create the selection is totally up to you. It doesn't matter. And just simply come to here and drop this down. And drop the opacity of this down. Now, as you can imagine, there's other ways of approaching it. If this looks a little cheesy to you, which really isn't working for me, I would throw that in the trash and instead copy that this way. And the best way to do that is to go with the clone stamp, go up under Window, Clone Source, flip this horizontal. So click here as our source, and then effectively clone backwards. A very quick, simple, easy solution to the problem. When you're done, make sure that you turn it back to normal and then turn it off. Up under this eye here, I noticed that it has some strange bulge to it. This is simply fixed by cloning from up here downward. Obviously, make a little bit more attempt at lining it up, but that's effectively what we're doing. It's just some strange bulge that I noticed. Another thing that caught my eye is because you were so focused up here in the face, that down here in the hands, we still had blemishes like this and some of these other things, as well as up here in the nails, there was just a little bit of something that could be cleaned up. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying it's bad or anything, but if we're going to start talking about doing this for real, let's just do it for real. This whole hand just looks very veiny. There is a way to correct this, but I'm not going to go into this video because it's a bit much. If you know how to do it, please fix that. If you don't, you and I, Felipe, will talk about that at a later point in time. The other big thing that I noticed here was that this chin right here is the same color as her cheeks, which I found very odd. So basically we need to reduce the amount of saturation on her chin because I realize it's curving underneath, but it's just doing something strange down here and it shouldn't be the exact same color. So reduce the saturation down here. Another area that I want to talk about is up here at the top of her head. She has this bald spot effectively that's going on here, and because it's covered by the hair, it's brighter, lighter, and otherwise with the light it's just distracting to me. So I want to correct this. So there's a couple different ways to do it, and I'm actually going to start with liquefy. So now this goes back to an earlier topic where because the way you worked, where you kept building up and then you would flatten and build up some more, that doesn't allow you to go backwards. So now I've come across a new problem 20 minutes later, and I can actually go back here to the smart filter of liquefy and just double click on it, and now I go right back into where I was. And that is the beauty of smart objects and smart filters. If you would like to learn more about smart objects and smart filters, simply go to theartofretouching.com, and on the right hand side I have a video about smart objects and smart filters. It's actually an entire class, to be honest with you, but it's filled with a whole bunch of useful information. So let's see here. I was talking about this area, right? So we need to get rid of this, and I would just think the easiest way to address this is to cover it with existing hair. So I'm going to take this brush with the hair, and I'm just going to start moving it in like this. Simply as a start. I mean, why not, right? I mean, look at how much smaller it is now than it used to be. If you want to fill in a little bit more, make your brush a little bigger, and push and push. There you go. No one will ever know that you did anything at all. Click OK. Now, even if left alone, it's way less distracting than it was, but if you want to take it a step further, simply do a very simple mask in here and darken it. Basically, just darken it a little bit with a tone of brown that kind of matches what's in the surrounding areas of her hair, and it'll all but disappear and no one will even notice. A very quick example would be a brush, quick mask, and I'm just being extremely quick about this. Come out of it, go to a curve, and just drop the curve. See, very simple, very easily, and when you go to full size, it becomes way less noticeable or distracting than it was, and I didn't put any real effort into it. And one of the last things I want to address with you here is the amount of detail that's actually going on inside of the hair. Consider this. I don't know how much you know about photography, but if you were to use an f-stop of f8, I would expect to see this. You would have all the detail as it wraps around the hair. And this is actually too much detail. It's actually distracting, technically. So what I would recommend is to create an f-stop digitally that closer matches to an f1.4 or f1.8, which is effectively just blurring the back of her head, is really all I'm talking about. So let me just show you that a little bit. If you look at this, you'll see every hair follicle that goes all the way back to the back of her head. What I'm suggesting is that we do something along these lines. So for simplicity's sake, all I did was make a duplicate of this background layer. And this is not how I would actually do it because this is actually diminishing returns. But for simplicity's sake, I will rasterize the layer and put a mask on this with my quick mask brush and simply wrap it around her head like this. Invert it so I'm not doing as much. Create a mask from this. So we come out of the quick mask, create a mask from it. So effectively we have this, is what it is. And on this layer itself, and simply add a Gaussian blur to it. If I zoom up, I go filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and then increase this, and then you'll be able to see what happens. So we just drop this back a little bit. But at its core, this way we aren't being distracted by every detail as it runs to the back of our head. We don't need to see that. We only care about what's in the focus point up here in the front. So other than naming these layers and maybe even consolidating them just a little bit, at its core, this is kind of where your image needs to go direction-wise, as well as some of the notes that I made separately about the chin and whatever, as well as the flyaways. And in general, this is a little bit more of what I have in mind, and I hope that you understand what I chose and why I chose to correct them. I mean, that's more important than the technical aspect of it. It's more about why I wanted to do it. So while there are always other things that do come to mind, especially as you make these changes, more changes become apparent. But for a first round, this is a direction that I think that you should be heading in. And we can fine tune it once we get it a lot closer to where it needs to be, because generally this is at least a balanced image. You don't have to like it technically, many of the aspects of it, changing the background, squishing the head, and other things that I did. It's a matter of looking at the original image that we have here, which at the very least, I hope you can see is green and distracting from where the focus point is. And that this image is much stronger when we adjust the tone and the color a little bit to bring your attention here up to the face. And I hope after seeing these changes that leads you to think for yourself other changes that you can incorporate into your own image to make it look a whole lot better. My name is John Ross for theartofretouching.com. Thank you for joining me.